Because the US version of the PC Engine, the TurboGrafx 16, was such a niche product to begin with, all of the beloved games for it could be considered cult classics. And the cultiest of those cult games might be Military Madness, or Nectaris to jump back to the Japanese name. This is a game that stuck in the imaginations of TurboGrafx players, and for very good reason. I think there's a good case to be made that Nectaris is the best wargame released to this point. And I'm not confining myself to just consoles here either. What do I mean by wargame? After all, so many games involve wars. Well, let's jump back a couple of decades. One of the nerdier hobbies you could have in the 60s and 70s was wargaming. A style of board gaming that had you play out battles with dozens of pieces under your control and thick rule books that were determined to replicate a real battle in exacting detail. Since these were popular with nerds, it didn't take long for them to transition to computer games. But not video game consoles. Game consoles in the 70s and early 80s weren't able to handle the complexity of the games, and then by the time systems that could do it came around, the market for wargames was firmly attached to computers. Well, because they were on computers, designers took the opportunity to make them even more fiddly and detail-obsessed. You might only be able to fit a couple bits of information on a piece for a board game. On a computer, you could include the fuel economy for a tank traveling through every kind of terrain. Of course, this had the consequence that only the most obsessed wargamer could play wargames. By the end of the 80s, the writing was on the wall, and wargames on computers were just going to be a shrinking niche. But there were some people who were trying to streamline wargaming, particularly in Japan, where streamlining it meant you could make a console version. Nintendo's Famicom Wars was about as simplified as you could get and still be a wargame. But the real granddaddy of Japanese wargaming was Daisen Ryaku. Featured modern combat, huge scenarios, and it got a Famicom port in late 1988. The thing is, even these console wargames weren't very accessible. You might have to play with the manual in front of you to understand certain things. They might just be a collection of scenarios where you pick one out and play it. Or they might be so simplified that they lose any flavor of wargaming, lacking any real tactical consideration other than making sure you slammed bigger units into smaller ones. And then here comes Hudson with Nectaris, a game that retains the depth of wargaming while making a point of being as accessible as possible to players. Nectaris doesn't just have scenarios, it has a campaign. There's 16 maps, and then after you've played the 16th map, you go back to the first one with a completely different set of units that requires that you take advantage of all the skills you built up playing the first 16. And these scenarios are a progression. Nectaris is a game that is built to teach you how to play it. There's a manual option from the main screen to give you some of the technical details, but once you know the interface, you don't need anything else. There's a progression to the scenarios. You start out on a small map with just infantry, tanks, and a choke point. Your goal on every scenario is to either wipe out all of the enemy units or capture their base. And those infantry can go around the choke point. Slowly, but they can sneak over the mountains or cross the canyon and capture the base while you're locking down the rest of the army. The choke point is set up so you can see how terrain affects different units, and more importantly, the effects it has on battle. And because everyone bunches up at that single point, you even get an example of the effects of support. These are all the basic techniques you need to know, and they're naturally taught to you in this first scenario. And the next scenario opens the map up a bit, gives you more units, and now you need to learn a bit more about how to maneuver effectively. And that's the way it goes. I'd say about the first dozen scenarios are all about introducing a new concept to you and giving you a map to take advantage of that. Now, Nectaris is one of the very rare cases where a highly detailed PC Engine game was completely translated to English. So let's flip over to the TurboGrafx 16 version for the rest of this. Okay, and this actually gives us a chance to look at the introduction for once. In the 21st century, the moon has been colonized, but the Axis Empire wants to use those colonies as a base to invade the Earth. They've taken over the moon and are preparing a super weapon. The colonists rise up and fight back. The scenarios are played out on a hex grid, as is traditional for wargames, and every unit represents 8 vehicles or people. On every turn, each side has to move all of their units, and then let the other side move all of their units. The command to move is Shift, and for most of your forces, you can move and then attack, or attack and then stay in place. There are exceptions, though, where they can move, attack, and then move again. In fact, a lot of units have special abilities or restrictions. How do you keep track of these? Well, you select a unit and then press Guide. There you'll find all the information you need and a nice paragraph letting you know how the unit should be used. Yet, Military Madness was not a trivial game to localize. A few more abilities that are vital to know about. Infantry are the only units that can capture structures. That's your enemy base or any factories that you encounter. Factories will generate fresh units and will often have a supply in them when you start a scenario. That makes capturing them a priority, and then you can just shift units out of the factory. Some of your forces have indirect fire. They can attack a certain range away, but can't fight back if somebody gets up close to them. Similar to that are anti-aircraft units. They can only attack things in the air. And that isn't just anti-aircraft guns, there's also interceptor fighters that it applies to. The early scenarios can be played in a few minutes, but by the time you reach scenario 10, you're really looking at closer to half an hour, and the final maps are huge. You can't save your progress in scenario, but the scenario names are passwords to let you continue at that point. Military Madness has a 2-player mode if you want to take on your friends, though the scenarios aren't really balanced around that. You can also play as the Axis if you like, by holding down Select and button 1, then pressing Start on the main menu. While Nectaris and Military Madness weren't hits, they gained enough of a following to justify some sequels and remakes. Earthlight on the Super Famicom is a pseudo-sequel made by the same staff, and Neo Nectaris is a sequel that we'll see very late in the PC Engine library. Hudson ported and released the game for free on Windows systems, as well as released ports for the PlayStation and Game Boy. As for this original release, it might be the best regarded strategy game on the PC Engine, and definitely the most popular wargame for it. Nectaris, or Military Madness, is a game that beautifully smooths the complexity of those original wargames in a way that makes it incredibly approachable. There are very few wargames out there that guide the player through learning them like this. And I think this is the most approachable of them all. Maybe if there were more games like Nectaris out there, then wargaming wouldn't have shrunk down to the microscopic genre that we have now.